Here we have the first episode of the e4 opening series. We start off with the Ruy Lopez that is characterized by e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. What bishop b5 does for white is that it allows white to castle quickly and develop his pieces faster than black. Another thing it does is that white is able to use this c3 pawn to his advantage in a long-term plan and to expand in the center. So for example, if black plays a6, here, 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 bishop b7, and both sides develop, white doesn't play knight c3, but he plays c3 in order to help him, in order to advance, in order to prepare a d4 advance in the center. Typically, because white doesn't play knight c3, he usually plays c3, and after b5, this is not the typical move order, but after moves like these, where after white expands in the center, white has the plan of moving his knight to d2, f1, and to g3, and target the f5 square and continue and start an attack on the king side, potentially for white. That is a typical plan for white in the Ruy Lopez, and the move bishop to b5 not blocking the c3 pawn is the characteristic of that plan. Now, black, when you're black in this position, you're thinking, okay, with all that taken into consideration, black can say, you know what, those are your advantages in the position. Black's advantages is that he can harass the white light squared bishop, because typically in the Ruy Lopez openings, white wants to preserve this bishop, and after conducting the plan of c3 to d4, he brings the bishop back and hides it on c2. However, if he's not careful, he may have that bishop traded off beforehand. So for example, after a6, white could take, but that's the exchange variation, which most strong players don't play. After bishop a5, b5, bishop a4, and b5, bishop b3. After defending the pawn on e5, white needs to play c3 in order to prepare the d4 advance and bring his bishop back to c2, because if he doesn't, if he just castles, black can now, after defending the e5 pawn, can go after that bishop, and this bishop cannot have influence down this diagonal or come back to c2 and have influence on this diagonal after the center opens up. So white wants to preserve this bishop. Even though he's attacking the knight, he really does not want to exchange it at all. He wants to preserve the bishop. So that's one of the advantages for black. He can harass that bishop, and he can, while he's doing that, gain quick development and space on the queen side. Another advantage for black is that white has to learn a lot of theory. The Ruy Lopez is a very theoretical opening, and white needs to learn all the variations before he can fully grasp. Like, if you're learning the Ruy Lopez, you need to learn lots of variations in order to fully grasp it and be prepared for any type of defense. Black really needs to only choose from one defense. He could go for the Berlin defense, which is a classical new opening that was brought into the competitive world championship sphere by Vladimir Kramnik, and when he beat Kasparov in the World Chess Championship in 2000, using the Berlin defense, when he was able to draw with black, and Garry Kasparov as white could not find a way to beat Vladimir Kramnik. Or black could play a6, and maybe instead of playing b5, play knight f6. There's lots of variations that he could choose from. And if white studies up on like a certain variation, like let's say they study up on the Morphy defense, and black knows that, they're going to say, oh well, I'll just use the Berlin defense. You didn't study up on that? I'm going to use it. Now obviously there's no way to know what your opponent studied up on. But black only really needs to study up on one defense, and one defense only. Now, let's go into the variations. exchange variation where after black plays a6, black chooses to attack the bishop. White takes the knight on c6. Now there's two ways to capture the exchange variation. In the exchange variation, black captures d takes c6 because after d takes c6, it opens up the black queen and bishop and allows for rapid development. On the other hand, if you take d takes c6, it does bring a pawn into the center, but black is still a ways away from achieving his development, while white can simply open up with d4, allow all of his pieces to be developed rapidly, and he's going to be able to achieve more space in the center. It's going to be hard for black to expand in the center, and this doubled pawns could be a weakness. So d takes c6 is the move in the Ruy Lopez exchange. And what this does is that the bishops are free to enter the game. White still needs to develop his queen side, and he needs to make a bunch of pawn moves in order to do so. However, black, he doesn't need to do that. He can simply, after, let's say, white plays d3, he can play bishop g4, queen d7, castle queen side. Very easy development for black in the exchange variation. Now what white argues is that, well, I have the superior pawn structure, and what if we are able to trade pieces, I'm going to be better in the endgame. But what black says is that, well, this doubled pawn I can use to push to c5 later in the game and help clamp down on d4. Plus, if the game ever opens up, I can use that towards my advantage using the double bishop pair. And that's basically the exchange variation. Black typically has a slight advantage because in most games that black wins, he's able to use the double bishop to the advantage, and the doubled c pawn is actually very useful in clamping down on d4. That's why one of the most common variations are d3, knight to c3, or castle kingside, and d4. Why does white play d4? Because after the trade, there's a trade of queens. So because white has the 4-3 majority now, and the superior pawn structure, white is happy that the queens are traded. However, black is saying, well, the game opened up more, and the effectiveness of my double bishop the double bishop pair will be more highlighted because there are less pieces on the board, and the game has opened up more. There's a trade of pawns in the center. Whenever there is a trade of pawns, it almost always means that the game opens up. The position's more open. In this variation, typically you see black playing bishop d7, knight c3, bishop b4, bishop here, and then castling. This is just a sample variation. And then you see how if white trades down all his pieces, he's going to have that 4-3 majority right here. And if black is able to develop an attack and, let's say, chip away at white center through the moves c5, f5, right? These are all moves that open up the position and disrupt white's plans. So that's the exchange variation. Let's look at the Morphy variation, which is characterized by the move a6. Now in this variation, this is more common. It's extremely more common, where white preserves his light square bishop and black just develops his knight to f6. White castles. Black plays bishop b5 and pawn to b5, and white plays bishop to b3, bishop to e7, rook e1, castles c3. Now here, there are two possible ways for black to play. Black can play the Marshall Gambit, which sacrifices the e5 pawn after the trade of pawns, and in return, after defending the knight on d5, black gains quick development, opens up his bishops, and gains quick development and an attack on the king side. So after c6, white plays d4 in order to gain more control of the center, open up his pieces. Black plays pawn to d6. White plays rook to e1, and now queen to h4, and you can see how, even though black is down a pawn, he has very influential pieces. His knight is in the center, controlling key squares, and he has both of his bishops aimed at the king side, and the queen is threatening a check on h2. So black is more developed in this variation. Even though he sacrifices a pawn, he has piece activity, and it's very hard. It's the position is roughly equal, but it's very hard to defend from white's side, and most chess players don't know how to defend. They know how to attack. So typically, wouldn't recommend this unless you really, really know the intricacies of the Marshall Gambit. If you're white, don't recommend this. Black, if you're black, you can use it as a trick on your opponents, because it's easier to attack when you have lots of piece activity. Even if you're down a pawn, you could still probably get that pawn back through your piece activity. Black is one move away from connecting his rooks. White needs to move his queen, bishop, and knight to connect his rooks, and he currently faces the threat of queen captures on h2, so a move like g3 is played, and black is one move away. Many light square weaknesses. This bishop is all the way on the queen side, not really helping out. And overall, white is a pawn up. Black has piece activity. I would recommend you go on YouTube, watch other videos, watch videos of the Marshall Gambit and how black is able to win through piece activity, and another game where white is able to consolidate and use his material advantage to win the game. But that's basically the Morphy variation. A quick note on if you don't want to enter the Marshall Gambit, I recommend you play d3, because now your bishop is able to enter the game, and it allows for quicker development. Because if d5 is played, this is worse for black, because now after the captures, the dark square bishop for white is able to easily come out of the game. So let's say after c6, you have knight to c3, and then after bishop d6, rook here, queen here, you can actually now capture. You can actually play g3 first, obviously, and then you can capture on d5. And after the capture, you attack the rook, and you're prepared to bring that bishop back to g2. That is basically how you refute the Marshall Gambit, because after playing c3, the knight cannot come and develop towards c3, which is a better square. Temporarily, contemporarily, a better square if you're trying to control d5 in order to prevent black to play the Marshall Gambit. So that's the Morphy defense. Usually, after c3 is played, you will see d6, and after, pawn to d4, you'll see knight a5 played. Bishop here. Actually, no, not bishop there. You won't see knight to a5. You'll see rook here, and then black brings bishop back, defend the e5 pawn, then attack that light square bishop, develop his bishop, c5. That is the typical plan for black, right? And white needs to put this knight on a good square, because it cannot come to c3, which is a good square for the knight, because it's being taken up by the pawn. So white reroutes his knight to g3, where it controls f5. And black attacks that bishop, and then, well, actually no, this pawn is not defended. First, he brings his bishop back. He gets ready to fianchetto. White brings his knight back, and then white brings his knight back, and then if a move like this is played, you could probably play pawn here, because you can actually recapture, because I don't think, black cannot capture with the knight, because then you'll have a fork on the two pieces with the white bishop. So this pawn is immune from capture, and so that's why black doesn't typically take. You will see g3. You'll see knight a5, bishop c2, pawn to bishop to b7, knight to g3, pawn to c5, d5, c4, and this is the typical structures that you'll enter if you want to enter the closed variation of the Morphy defense. You should look up Karpov's games. He is an excellent practitioner of the closed variation of the more closed positions of the Morphy variation. So now let's move on to this is not in order, but this is the third common variation in the Ruy Lopez. We have the Berlin defense, which is characterized by knight f6. Instead of attacking that bishop, black just continues development by bringing his knight out, and this clearly just says to white, I just want to develop my kingside pieces quickly. And after white castles, giving up this pawn temporarily, white can either play d4, and then after white can play d4, which is the main variation. Black plays knight d6, and then after white captures, because if he captures with the pawn, this bishop is going to be captured soon, and white doesn't want to lose that bishop for nothing, so he's going to take. Black's going to take. After there's a capture, knight here. This is the main variation of the Berlin defense, where black has an uncastled king, but he has the two bishops, and he can use that c5 pawn later, and an active knight. And white has the superior pawn structure, and this is actually a very interesting position that you should study. You should look at. Magnus Carlsen played these positions, and I think it was Viswanathan who used it, or another player. No, not Viswanathan. It was in the 2014 World Chess Championship, I think, where this defense was employed. This is actually the variation that Kramnik used in 2000 World Chess Championship, and it's really interesting opening that you should study. It's only like 20 years old, so not a lot of developed theory behind it as other variations of the Ruy Lopez. But that's the main variation, where you have d4 on move 3. The other main variation is rook to e1, where after this knight moves, let's say if black tries to defend with d5, it's actually a bad move, because now this knight is going to be captured, and it's going to be given doubled pawns, and the white rook is lined up with the black king. So typically d5 is not played, but that knight comes back, and white does not capture, but he rather captures the e5 pawn, and after black captures, white captures, bishop here. You see d4, castles, and the game goes on. Now we note that the knight is on d6, blocking that d5 pawn, so typically you either see this knight move. You don't see d4, because that loses the bishop. Obviously it gets traded, but again, white doesn't want to lose that bishop, so he brings it back to f1, castles, and then you see d4. So the knight on d6 blocks that d pawn, so typically black develops his bishop through b6. You should see 2016 Magnus Carlsen versus Sergei Karyakin, where Magnus Carlsen uses this variation as white to positionally crush Karyakin. He didn't win, but he had a winning position, and he was able to use his positional advantage of the fact that this knight is blocking the d pawn and doubled pawn on the d file. He was able to take this drawish variation where there's almost complete symmetry with the pawns, no real differences, 4 on the queen side, 3 on the king side for both sides. He's able to take this position and almost beat Karyakin in the game. In the game he drew, but it's a very spectacular game that could have ended a win for Magnus Carlsen. But again, check it out, it's good. And that is the two main variations of the Berlin defense. Hope you enjoyed. This is all This is the three main variations of the Ruy Lopez. Make sure you study all the variations, lots of theory behind this opening, and go ahead and go online and play this opening as much as you can. And I'll see you guys later.